Imagine you are Sultan Mehmed II, the legendary emperor known as the Conqueror, the man who brought down the 1,000-year-old Byzantine Empire. Under your command marches the most powerful army in the world, on its way to crush the rebellion of a defiant prince. But as you near his capital, the atmosphere suddenly shifts. A chilling silence falls over the land, followed by a wave of stench so foul it brings tears to the eyes of even your battle-hardened warriors. And then you see it. Not a fortress, not an army, but a vast field stretching to the horizon, filled with 20,000 wooden stakes. Atop each stake, a human body. No chaos, no randomness. This is not the aftermath of war. This is a forest of death, meticulously arranged like a masterpiece of cold-blooded cruelty. A message written in blood and terror. You, a man who has never known defeat, now stand before this silent horror, and for the first time in your life you issue an unthinkable command. Retreat. So who could turn fear itself into a weapon strong enough to halt the mightiest army on earth? His name was Vlad Dracula, and the answer to that mystery lay not in the crown upon his head, but in the brutal childhood that forged a monster. To understand the man who could create such a spectacle, we must travel back in time, to a world balanced on a knife's edge. In the winter of 1431, in a stone house in Transylvania, a child was born who would one day be known by many names. His father, Vlad II, was a powerful man, a member of a sacred Christian military group called the Order of the Dragon. This order was dedicated to one single, desperate purpose: defending the heart of Europe from the relentless expansion of the Ottoman Empire. Because of this, he was known as Dracul, the Romanian word for dragon. And so, his young son would forever be known as Dracula, the son of the dragon. His home, the small principality of Wallachia, was not a kingdom of peaceful fields and quiet villages. It was a buffer state, a patch of blood-soaked ground caught between two mighty forces. To the east, the unstoppable Ottoman Empire pushed ever westward. To the west, the Christian kingdom of Hungary pushed back. Wallachia was the place where these two worlds collided, and its rulers learned a difficult lesson early on. Neutrality was not an option. Survival meant choosing a side, praying you chose the right one, and knowing that betrayal was as common as the rising sun. This was the world young Vlad was born into. A world where power was not earned through loyalty or love, but through fear. And fear, he would soon learn, was a lesson taught through pain. But the moment that truly transformed the boy into the monster he would become happened when he was just 11 years old. His father was summoned to a diplomatic meeting with the Ottoman Sultan, Murad II. It was a trap, but a ruler like Dracul had no choice but to walk into it. He brought his two youngest sons with him, 11-year-old Vlad and his 7-year-old brother Radu. The moment they crossed into Ottoman lands, the diplomatic smiles vanished, and they were taken into custody. The Sultan offered Vlad's father an impossible choice. He could leave his sons behind as hostages, a guarantee of his future loyalty, or he could watch them perish before his very eyes. What does a father do? What does a king do? He chose his own freedom. He rode away, leaving his two young boys in the hands of his greatest enemy. For young Vlad, watching his father's figure shrink into the distance was the last moment of his childhood. From that day forward, he was utterly alone. In the Ottoman court, noble hostages were, on the surface, treated with a certain respect. They were given an education in languages, philosophy, and military strategy. For Vlad's younger brother, Radu, this new life was an opportunity. He was handsome and charming, and he adapted quickly. He learned the customs, embraced the culture, and eventually became a favourite of the new Sultan Mehmed II. Some accounts from that time whisper that their relationship was much closer than that of a ruler and his ward. But Vlad was different. He refused to bend. He met every kindness with suspicion and every command with defiance. He would spit at his Turkish tutors and openly challenge those who spoke ill of his faith. For this stubbornness, he was made to endure the harsh discipline of his captors. He was subjected to brutal treatments designed to break the will of even the strongest men. Yet, something unexpected happened. These experiences did not break Vlad. They sharpened him. But the most important part of his education was not what was done to him, but what he was forced to watch. The Ottomans understood that power came from public displays of force, and their preferred method for special enemies, for those who deserved not just to have their life taken, but to serve as a public warning, was impalement. The young prince was made to witness these spectacles day after day. He watched as men were forced onto long wooden stakes, their own weight slowly pulling them down. He learned with a cold and chilling focus the terrible science of it all. He saw that the stakes had to be rounded at the tip, not sharp, to avoid piercing vital organs too quickly. He observed how, if angled just right, the stake could travel up through the body, emerging from the shoulder or the mouth, keeping the victim conscious for hours, sometimes even days, in a state of unimaginable suffering. While other children might have recoiled in horror, Vlad studied. He was a 12-year-old boy watching men die by inches, and he was filing away every single detail. This was not just punishment, it was a masterclass in the art of terror. Meanwhile, back in his homeland, the world he once knew was falling apart. His father, trying to play both sides against the middle, ultimately failed. In 1447, Wallachian nobles, with the backing of Hungary, ambushed his father in the marshes. His life was taken there, cut down by the very men who had sworn to protect him. But they saved a special kind of cruelty for Vlad's older brother, Mircea. The nobles captured him alive. First they blinded him with red-hot iron pokers. Then, while he was still conscious, they buried him alive. The man who should have been Vlad's protector passed from this world choking on dirt, clawing at the earth above him. When the news of his family's fate reached the Ottoman court, his captors watched the now 16-year-old Vlad closely. They expected rage, or tears, or a vow of revenge. Instead, they saw a strange and unnerving calm. He simply asked a quiet question. How long did my brother take to pass away underground? His Ottoman keepers did not realize what they were looking at. 6 years of harsh treatment had not broken him. They had hollowed him out and filled the empty space with something cold, hard, and patient. Every moment of his captivity had not been a lesson in submission, but a lesson in how to inflict suffering. The Ottomans, seeing this hardened young man, decided he might be a useful tool. They released him, giving him a small force to reclaim his father's throne. They believed they were placing a pawn on the board. They had no idea they had just unleashed a monster of their own creation. That first attempt to claim the throne of Wallachia was short-lived. A 17-year-old prince backed by an Ottoman force was quickly driven out. His reign lasted only 2 months, but those brief weeks offered a chilling preview of the man he was becoming. There is a story from that time of a merchant who complained that his goods had been stolen. In response, Vlad had the feet of the suspected thief skinned and salt rubbed into the raw flesh. This wasn't justice, it was an experiment in pain. It was just practice. For the next 8 years, Vlad became a wanderer, a prince without a kingdom. He served in various armies, learning the practical arts of warfare that his Ottoman education had only covered in theory. He fought for different masters, even serving alongside the very Hungarian regent John Hunyadi, who had been responsible for his father's and brother's demise. For a man like Vlad, revenge was a dish best served cold, and knowledge was more valuable than pride. He studied how to build fortifications, how to command cavalry, and most importantly how to wage psychological warfare. He was building more than just military skill. He was building a network of supporters, men who shared his deep-seated hatred for both the encroaching Ottomans and the treacherous nobles, the boyars, who had kept Wallachia weak for generations. Finally, in 1456, his moment arrived. With Hungarian support, he invaded Wallachia once more. The ruling prince, Vladislav II, met him on the field of battle. According to the legends, it was not a clash of armies, but a duel of leaders. Vlad did not just defeat his rival, he made an example of him. He's said to have beheaded him slowly, ensuring his enemy was aware of every moment. Now the throne was his, and this time he would not be driven from it. Vlad inherited a kingdom in chaos. It was torn apart by civil war, constantly threatened by foreign powers, and run by a class of nobles who had murdered his own family. A traditional ruler would have moved carefully, building alliances and slowly consolidating power. But Vlad was not a traditional ruler. He knew that these men, the boyars, respected only one thing: absolute, undeniable force. He would not just punish them. He would use their punishment to send a message so terrifying that no one would dare challenge him ever again. The stage for this lesson was set on Easter Sunday of 1457. Vlad invited hundreds of boyar families to a grand feast at his palace. These were the very men who had conspired against his father, the ones who had buried his brother alive. They arrived in their finest silks and jewels, their families in tow, believing the young prince was seeking peace and reconciliation. The great hall was filled with music and laughter. Wine flowed freely, and for a moment it seemed as if a new era of cooperation was dawning in Wallachia. Then, as the feast reached its peak, Vlad stood to address his guests. He spoke of forgiveness, of unity, and of the bright future of their shared homeland. Then, his tone shifted. He asked a simple, curious question. "How many different princes," he asked the assembled nobles, "have you seen rule this land in your lifetimes?" "Drunk on wine and arrogance," the boyars answered honestly. "Some boasted of seeing 5 rulers come and go, others 7. A few of the oldest men proudly admitted to having served under 30 different princes. With each answer, they were unknowingly signing their own death warrants. They were confessing to a lifetime of betrayal, admitting they had survived by switching their allegiance whenever it was convenient. Loyalty be damned. Vlad listened patiently, a faint smile on his lips. Then he gave a signal. The music stopped. Soldiers, who had been hidden throughout the palace, burst through every door, sealing the exits. In moments, the feast hall was transformed from a place of celebration into a trap. The boyars, who had played the Game of Thrones for decades, suddenly found themselves as pawns in a much more brutal contest. For the older nobles, the ones who had directly participated in his father's downfall, the end was swift and horrific. They were dragged out into the palace courtyard and impaled on the spot. Their screams became the new music for the feast. But for the younger, stronger nobles and their families, Vlad had something far more elaborate in mind. He did not want to grant them the release of a quick end. Still dressed in their fine Easter clothing, they were chained together and forced to march 50 miles north, through rugged mountain passes to the ruins of an old castle overlooking the Arges River. This would become his fortress, Pernari Castle, known to history as Castle Dracula. And these nobles would be its builders. For months they were forced into brutal slave labour. They carried stones, mixed mortar and raised walls, working until their expensive clothes rotted from their bodies. When they collapsed from exhaustion, their lives were ended on a stake, their bodies sometimes even incorporated into the very walls they were building. This single, horrific event, which history would remember as the Easter feast, accomplished exactly what Vlad intended. He eliminated an entire generation of disloyal nobility, the very people who had kept Wallachia in a state of perpetual weakness. More than that, he sent a clear and unmistakable message to everyone, from the lowest peasant to the kings of neighbouring lands. The old rules no longer applied. Under Vlad Dracula, loyalty was absolute, and the price for betrayal was a fate far worse than a simple execution. The stories of that day spread like wildfire, carried by horrified diplomats and merchants. A new kind of power had arrived in Eastern Europe, one that did not play by the established rules of politics or warfare. It was a power built on the meticulous and creative application of human suffering. With his domestic enemies either eliminated or silenced by fear, Vlad turned his attention to the world outside his borders. His methods became more refined, his cruelty more theatrical. The punishment itself was not the point. The story of the punishment was the true weapon. Foreign merchants and diplomats, who were often spared, became his unwilling messengers, spreading tales of his rule throughout Europe and the Ottoman Empire. One German merchant arriving in Vlad's capital city described finding the central square transformed into what he called a forest of the dying. Hundreds of stakes had been arranged in precise geometric circles. On them were victims in every stage of their final journey. The smell was so overpowering, he wrote, that the horses refused to enter the city gates. The psychological impact was devastating. Trade routes that once passed through Wallachia began to divert, as merchants chose longer, more arduous paths to avoid even the possibility of encountering Vlad's brand of justice. He began to innovate, to move beyond simple impalement. Historical records, though often embellished, speak of a horrifying creativity. He developed variations for specific crimes. Liars might be impaled through the mouth, thieves through the skull. He explored other methods too, boiling victims in large cauldrons of oil, or skinning them alive in long strips. Each punishment was tailored not for a swift end, but for maximum psychological impact on anyone who witnessed it. One of his own boyars, accompanying him to a mass execution, could not stand the stench of the scene. He covered his nose in disgust. Vlad noticed this immediately. "Does the smell bother you?" he asked with a tone of pleasant concern. When the man admitted that it did, Vlad had him impaled on a stake much higher than the others. "There," he's said to have remarked, "you will be above the unpleasant odours." It was a chilling display of his absolute power and his dark, mocking sense of humour. This brings us to the year 1462, and the incident that would forever cement his reputation in history. The Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed II, the same man who had been his captor as a boy, sent ambassadors to Vlad's court. Their demands were simple: pay the overdue tribute and provide 500 Wallachian boys to be trained as janissaries, the elite soldiers of the Ottoman army. When the Ottoman envoys were brought before him, they refused to remove their turbans, citing religious custom. In medieval diplomacy, this was a calculated sign of disrespect, implying that their own ruler was superior. Vlad smiled and congratulated them on their deep devotion to their traditions. Then he announced that he would help them uphold these traditions permanently. He ordered his guards to seize the ambassadors and nail their turbans directly to their skulls with long iron spikes. The men were then impaled, still wearing their holy headgear, now a permanent part of them. Their bodies were sent back toward Ottoman territory, a gruesome and unmistakable reply to the Sultan's demands. This was an act of war. The murder of ambassadors was one of the gravest offences in the medieval world, a violation of sacred laws that governed relations between kingdoms. Sultan Mehmed, the conqueror, who had toppled the 1,000-year-old Byzantine Empire, was not a man to suffer such an insult. He gathered a massive army, some say as many as 150,000 men, and marched on Wallachia himself. His goal was not just to collect tribute, it was to erase Vlad from the face of the earth. Vlad, with an army of perhaps 30,000, knew he could not win a direct battle. He was a master of warfare, but he was also a realist. He could not defeat the Ottomans with swords and shields, so he decided to defeat them with fear. As the massive Ottoman army advanced, they found a wasteland. Vlad had implemented a scorched earth policy of unimaginable cruelty. He burned every village, poisoned every well, and destroyed every crop. But he did more than that. He transformed his own homeland into a landscape of horror. The wells were poisoned not just with chemicals, but with the decomposing bodies of the impaled. Villages were not just empty, they were populated with the impaled corpses of their former residents, staged in grotesque tableaus of daily life. The Ottoman army, the most powerful fighting force in the world, marched through a silent country of ash and death, their morale eroding with every step. One night, under the cover of darkness, Vlad led a small elite force of cavalry and infiltrated the massive Ottoman camp. Their goal was audacious and suicidal: to find the Sultan's personal tent and assassinate him. The raid was chaos and confusion. In the dark, they attacked the wrong tent and the Sultan escaped unharmed. But the military objective was secondary. The true purpose was psychological. Vlad had proven that not even the Sultan, surrounded by 100,000 soldiers, was safe from his reach. As his men retreated, they captured several hundred Ottoman soldiers. Vlad had them impaled immediately, lining the road that the main Ottoman army would take the next day. The advancing soldiers were forced to march past their dying comrades, listening to their pleas and screams for hours. This all led to the final, terrible masterpiece. As Sultan Mehmed and his army approached Vlad's capital of Targoviste, they found the gates wide open. There were no defenders on the walls. The city was silent. The Sultan, suspecting an ambush, advanced with caution. And then he saw it. For miles around the city, covering a vast plain, stood a forest of stakes. 20,000 of them. On each stake was a human being, captured Ottoman soldiers, Wallachian traitors, men, women and children. Some had been there for weeks, their bodies blackened and rotting. Others were more recent additions, still moving, still making sounds. The stakes were arranged in concentric circles, with the highest-ranking prisoners on the tallest stakes in the centre. Sultan Mehmed II, the man who had seen the bloody fall of Constantinople, who had witnessed every horror that 15th century warfare had to offer, stared at this scene. The sight, the smell, the sheer, methodical madness of it all broke something in him. He reportedly looked at his generals and said, "I cannot take the land of a man who does such things." He then gave the order to retreat. The man who never retreated, retreated. Vlad had won. He had defeated one of history's greatest armies not with soldiers, but with terror. As the Ottomans fled, Vlad walked among his creation like an artist in a gallery, observing which methods of impalement were the most effective, which produced the longest suffering. This was not just a tactic of war. For Vlad, it was a source of profound, dark satisfaction. The retreat of the mighty Ottoman army should have been Vlad's greatest triumph. He had faced the world's most powerful empire and turned it back, not with strength of arms, but with the sheer force of his terrifying will. Yet, the very methods that had secured his victory would also lead to his ruin. His cruelty, once a calculated tool of statecraft, had become an all-consuming fire. It had saved his throne, but it had burned away every bridge to his allies, his nobles, and his own people. The Ottomans, though they had retreated, did not give up. They left behind Vlad's own brother, Radu, the handsome, charming boy who had thrived in the Sultan's court. Radu, now a man and a loyal commander for the Sultan, offered the weary Wallachian nobles a simple choice: continue to live under the shadow of the Impaler, or support him and know peace. For the boyars, who had lived in constant terror, it was not a difficult decision. Vlad's army began to melt away as his own countrymen abandoned him. The fear that had held his kingdom together was now the very thing tearing it apart. Defeated not by a foreign army but by his own reputation, Vlad fled to Hungary, seeking aid from his supposed ally, King Matthias Corvinus. But King Matthias had also grown weary of Vlad's excesses. While Vlad had been a useful buffer against the Ottomans, his methods were becoming a political embarrassment. Stories of his atrocities were spreading across Europe, painting his Christian allies with the same dark brush. When Vlad arrived in Hungary seeking help, he was arrested. He would spend the next 12 years as a prisoner. It was not a harsh dungeon captivity. It was a form of political house arrest. But even in confinement, the darkness within him could not be contained. Guards at his place of imprisonment reported unsettling habits. They would find rats in his chambers, carefully impaled on small wooden splinters. Birds that flew into his room would be found skewered on sharpened quills. He would arrange insects on pieces of wood, creating miniature versions of his gruesome forests. When asked why he did these things, he reportedly replied that he did not want to lose his skill. For 12 years he practiced his craft on the only victims available to him, waiting for the day he might once again have a larger canvas. During these years of imprisonment, Vlad's legend grew. With the recent invention of the printing press, pamphlets began to circulate, particularly in the German states. These sensational accounts detailed his deeds, often with gruesome illustrations. They told of him dining amongst the impaled, dipping his bread in the blood of his victims. They described his arbitrary cruelty, impaling a merchant for a torn shirt, or a woman for not properly caring for her husband. Whether every one of these stories was true is debatable, but they were based on a well-documented reality. The historical man was slowly disappearing, replaced by a mythological figure of absolute evil. Then, in 1476, the political winds shifted once again. The Ottoman threat was resurgent, and Hungary needed a ruthless, effective leader on the Wallachian border. They needed a dragon. And so, Vlad the Impaler was released. He was given a new wife from the Hungarian nobility and an army to reclaim his throne for a third and final time. He was now in his mid-40s, older and perhaps wiser, but no less cruel. The moment he returned to power, the impalements began again. If anything, his years in confinement had only distilled his methods into a purer form of terror. He now added new layers of psychological torment to his punishments. He would force families to watch one another being impaled, starting with the children, then the mother, and finally the father, prolonging the agony for every member of the family. His reign of terror, however, was destined to be brief. The Wallachia he returned to was not the same one he had left. His reputation was now so fearsome that it left no room for loyalty, only fear, and fear is a fragile foundation for a throne. In December of 1476, only a few months after his return to power, Vlad was marching with a small force when he was ambushed by an Ottoman army. The details of his final moments are lost to history. Some say he was overwhelmed and cut down in the heat of battle. Others whisper a darker tale, that he was assassinated by his own men who were finally unwilling to serve such a monstrous master. What we know for certain is this: his life ended as violently as it had been lived. His head was severed from his body and taken to Constantinople. There, Sultan Mehmed II, the man who had fled from him in terror years before, had it displayed on a stake above the city gates. In a final grim irony, the impaler was himself impaled, if only in death. His body was said to have been buried in a monastery, but when archaeologists opened his supposed tomb centuries later, in 1931, they found it empty. The monster had vanished, leaving only a legacy of blood and fear behind him. The story of Vlad Dracula does not end with his death. In a strange twist of history, the man who was a monster to so many is remembered by some in Romania as a national hero. A stern but necessary ruler who brought order to a chaotic land and stood defiantly against a foreign empire. They point to his harsh justice, which supposedly made the country so safe that a golden cup could be left untouched in a public square. They celebrate the defender of Christendom and quietly ignore the screams from his forests of the dead. This is perhaps the most unsettling part of his legacy. Not that monsters exist, but that we find ways to admire them. We reshape them into something more palatable, focusing on their strength while forgetting their cruelty. The historical Vlad was transformed centuries later by the novelist Bram Stoker into a supernatural creature of the night, a vampire. But the truth is far more disturbing. The fictional Dracula is frightening because he is inhuman. The real Vlad Dracula is terrifying because he was entirely human. His story serves as a chilling reminder of what a person can become when shaped by trauma, hardened by cruelty, and given absolute power. He was not a mindless brute. He was intelligent, calculating, and by some accounts even charming. And that is the true horror. His cruelty was not madness. It was a choice, a deliberate, methodical, and deeply personal art form. He proved that the darkest corners of the human soul need no supernatural explanation. The greatest monsters are not the ones that hide in the shadows of fiction. They are the ones who walk among us in the broad light of day. What does the story of Vlad the Impaler make you reflect on? Was he a hero who defended his people, a cruel tyrant, or a complex figure caught somewhere in between? We'd love to hear your perspective. Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoy uncovering the hidden truths behind controversial historical figures, support the channel by hitting like, subscribe, and turning on the notification bell so you won't miss our next video.